You told someone about your goal, maybe a friend, maybe a group chat, maybe a room full of people who nodded and said they believed in you. And for a moment, it felt like progress, like something had been set in motion, like the version of yourself you described had already begun to exist. That feeling was real. The progress was not. Because here is what Peter Gollwitzer, psychology professor at New York University, discovered in research published in Psychological Science. When you announce a goal, your brain registers the announcement as a form of achievement, not preparation for achievement, not motivation toward achievement. The dopamine arrives early, before the work, before the discomfort, before a single thing has actually changed. And once that dopamine arrives, the hunger that would have driven the work is already partially satisfied. You announced the goal, your brain said, "Good," and quietly began removing the urgency that would have made you do it. Marcus Aurelius understood this without a neuroscience laboratory. He wrote the Meditations for nobody, not for Rome, not for history, not for applause, for himself, in private, because he understood that the man who needs to tell others what he is becoming has already confused the telling with the becoming. This video is about that confusion, and about the men who have been feeding it for years while wondering why nothing is changing. Daniel has a goal. He has had it for 8 months. He has told his best friend, his colleague at work, his family at dinner, 3 people in a group chat who responded with fire emojis and genuine enthusiasm. Each announcement felt like a step forward. Each reaction felt like fuel. Each conversation about the goal felt like momentum building. But 8 months later, the goal is in exactly the same place. It was the day he first described it, not because he lacks intelligence, not because the goal was unrealistic, not because circumstances worked against him, because every time he felt the hunger, that should have driven the work. He fed it with an announcement instead, and the hunger, temporarily satisfied, went quiet. This is the mechanism, not laziness, not fear, not a lack of discipline in the traditional sense. The dopamine of announcement, consuming the fuel that the work would have required. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." The present of the man who keeps announcing is always the future where the goal exists, never the present where the work must happen. It's a question for you. Name the goal you have announced most often. How many times have you announced it? And how many hours have you worked on it this week? Peter Gollwitzer's research at NYU is one of the most important studies. Most men will never hear about. In controlled experiments, participants were divided into 2 groups. Both groups had identical goals. One group announced their goals publicly. One group kept them completely private. Both groups were then given 45 minutes to work on tasks that would move them toward their stated objectives. The group that announced their goals worked for an average of 33 minutes, then stopped, feeling, despite having done less, a greater sense of accomplishment than the work actually warranted. The group that stayed silent worked the full 45 minutes and still felt unsatisfied, still hungry, still driven by the gap between where they were and where they needed to be. Gollwitzer called this the intention-behavior gap, the distance between what you intend to do and what you actually do. His finding was precise. The more people you tell your goals to, the wider that gap becomes, not narrower, wider, because the social recognition that comes from announcing creates what Gollwitzer called a premature sense of completeness. Your brain cannot distinguish between the satisfaction of announcing an identity and the satisfaction of actually building it. Both produce the same internal signal. Both say, you are already that person. And the man who already feels like the person he is trying to become has significantly less reason to do the work of actually becoming him. Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire on earth. He was a philosopher, a general, a statesman. He spent 20 years writing one of the most important documents in the history of human thought. He never told anyone. The Meditations was not a book he planned to publish, not a philosophy he announced to his court, not an identity he performed for the men around him. It was a private record, a man holding himself accountable to a standard he never described publicly, because describing it publicly would have substituted the description for the standard. Epictetus taught his students one instruction, above all others about speech. First, learn the meaning of what you say, and then speak, not. First announce what you intend to become. First become it. Then, if speaking serves a purpose beyond the satisfaction of being heard, speak. Seneca was more direct. Retire into yourself as much as you can. Associate with people who are likely to improve you. Welcome those who you are capable of improving. The process is mutual. The retirement into yourself is not isolation. It is the deliberate protection of the hunger. That announcement would consume. The Stoics did not build in silence because they were secretive. They built in silence because they understood that the energy available for building is finite, and every announcement spends some of it. Another question for you. What would change about your relationship to your goal if nobody in your life knew it existed? Daniel is at dinner with friends. The conversation turns to ambitions, and Daniel, without planning to, describes the version of himself that exists 6 months from now, more disciplined, more focused, further along. The table listens, nods. Someone says they have no doubt he'll get there, and Daniel, for the rest of that evening, feels like he already has. This is the deepest damage that announcement does. Not just the dopamine consumption, not just the reduced urgency, the performance of an identity as a substitute for building one. Because identity is not built through description. It is built through repeated private action that nobody witnesses and nobody confirms. The man who describes his identity publicly and the man who builds it privately are engaged in completely different projects. One is building a reputation for what he intends. The other is building a character from what he does. Reputation requires an audience. Character requires only consistency. And the man who has been feeding his reputation for 8 months has been starving his character on the same diet. Here is what the research found about the men who stayed silent. They worked longer. They felt less satisfied during the work, which means they stayed hungrier, stayed driven, stayed connected to the gap between where they were and where they needed to be. And that gap, the discomfort of knowing you have not yet arrived, is not a problem to be solved through announcement. It is the engine. Gollwitzer's research recommended one specific behavioral change for men who wanted to close the intention-behavior gap. Form specific private plans, not public commitments, not accountability partnerships, not social media declarations. Private plans. When, where, how. Written for yourself. Executed without an audience. Measured by results, not reactions. This is precisely what Marcus Aurelius did. Not with a goal board, not with a declared intention, with a private journal that asked only one question of the man writing in it. Did I do what I said I would do today? No audience needed, no confirmation required, no announcement that could substitute for the answer. Daniel has a new goal. He has told nobody. Not because he is secretive, not because he doubts it, not because he has no one to tell, but because he has learned what happens to goals when they are fed into the social machine. Before they have been built into something real, they get satisfied prematurely. They get confused with identity performance. They get consumed by the dopamine that should have powered the work. So this time, he works. No announcement, no group chat update, no dinner table version of himself that exists 6 months from now. Just the work, just the hunger that stays intact because it has not been fed by description. Just the gap between where he is and where he is going, remaining uncomfortable enough to keep him moving. Weeks pass. Something is different, not visible to anyone around him, not announced, not confirmed by anyone's reaction, but the goal that has been in the same place for 8 months has moved, not because he became more disciplined, because he stopped consuming the fuel of his discipline before the work could use it. And one day, not dramatically, not with a speech, the goal exists, and the only person who knew it was coming was the man who never stopped being hungry for it. Marcus Aurelius never announced his philosophy. He lived it for 20 years, in private. Epictetus never announced his freedom. He built it, in chains, without an audience. The Stoics understood something about the relationship between speech and action that most men in 2026 are violating every day without knowing it. Words spend energy. Announcement consumes hunger. Description substitutes for identity. And the man who keeps describing what he is about to become is spending the exact fuel that becoming it requires. So here is the only announcement worth making. Nothing. Go do the work. Tell nobody. Stay hungry. And when the goal exists, not as something you described, but as something you built, it will announce itself. Comment below. What is the one goal you are going to stop announcing? Starting today? Subscribe to Unique Vision for the man who is done describing himself and ready to build himself.